thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Children's Rights Alliance for putting this series of events together. And thanks to Claire for framing this discussion in a really useful and helpful way. What I want to do is turn the focus onto Ireland, and I want to talk about what integration might mean in the context of Ireland, based on the various research projects that Mary outlined. But I want to start by getting us to think about what integration means and how we might define immigrant integration. And so there are a variety of ways in which integration gets defined. The first definition comes from a recent academic article published in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and it says, when we're talking about integration, we're talking about immigrants' participation in and their incorporation into a receiving society. So that's one way of thinking about integration. It's how immigrants live in and are welcomed into a particular society. A second way of thinking about integration comes from the work of the OECD and the European Union, where they say it's actually about looking at immigrants in relation to the native born. And they say that over time we can know that integration is happening if there is convergence between immigrants and the native born, particularly in relation to economic and social factors. So the assumption there is that there will be differences between immigrants and the native born, but we can see integration happening if those differences become less over time. So given that, what we wanted to do was look at this issue of immigrant integration in Ireland and link the question of immigrant integration, particularly this question of convergence, to the supports that are available in Ireland in order to try and bring about this outcome. So the particular research project that I'll talk to you about today was a project that's called Mapping Processes of Settlement and Integration in Ireland. So to start with integration, what we wanted to do was look precisely at these economic and social indicators for Ireland. This, of course, is measured already. The ESRI has a monitoring integration report which is published regularly. But what the ESRI tends to do is look at integration outcomes across all of Ireland for all immigrants. And what that does is miss important differences in the integration experiences of people from different migrant groups and in different parts of Ireland. So we thought we would look at two particular NUTS 3 regions. Claire talked about NUTS 2 regions. We're looking in a little bit more detail, particularly at the border region and the Dublin region, because their profiles are quite different. So we thought that would give important insights into precisely how place matters for integration. And we wanted to look at different groups too. So broadly, those categories of migrant groups were returning Irish, people from the newer EU countries, the EU 13 countries, and people from this group that in Ireland we call rest of world, which is a problematic category because it includes people who come to Ireland in lots of different ways. People who come as refugees and asylum seekers, people who come as student migrants, people who come as highly skilled workers recruited by multinational companies, and family members of those groups. So this rest of world category, which is what we use in Ireland, is problematic, and we're aware of that. But we wanted to see if there were differences showing up between these broad categories of migrants. The second thing we wanted to do was look at obstacles and supports for integration at this subnational region. And in particular, what we wanted to do was look at settlement services. Now, I know we use the word settlement particularly when we talk about refugees and asylum seekers in a particular way. How we use the word settlement is drawing on the Canadian example, where settlement services are the services that are provided to all immigrants, the services that help them in the process of integration. So we're using settlement services in a broad way, and what we wanted to do was see what kinds of settlement services are available to different migrant groups and in different regions, and where are there gaps in those services. So this was the project that we've been working on for the last year and a half. So if we're to think about immigrant integration, then we have to think about integration in three broad ways. The first is the outcomes of integration. And this is often described as indicators of integration. This is the work that the ESRI does in Ireland. It's the work that the OECD and the European Union have been doing. And I'll talk to you about what those indicators are in order to show convergence or divergence between immigrants and native-born. The second are the processes that help people get to this stage of integration. This is what we're calling settlement services. And the third are the policies that underpin or enable the processes, the integration processes leading to integration outcomes. My work with Cliona Murphy looked at integration policies in Ireland, and I'll refer to that at the very end, but I'm going to focus particularly on outcomes and processes in the Irish context. So to start with integration outcomes, the Zaragoza indicators are the indicators that are being used to look at integration outcomes right now, so developed particularly by the OECD. And the Zaragoza indicators are indicators of immigrant integration, so again, looking at the differences, the convergence, the divergence between immigrants and native-born across 5 different areas. And these have been chosen because there's reliable data. It allows for comparison between different countries, so we can see how Ireland is working and how integration in Ireland is happening compared to other countries. So the 5 areas that are looked at are employment, education, social inclusion, active citizenship, and welcoming society. So there's a wide range of these, and you can access them particularly through a report by Tom Huddleston and others. But the kinds of issues that are being looked at in employment are the kinds of employment that people have, the rate and the type of employment and unemployment, and also the level of overqualification. Are people working in areas that they're qualified for or not? Education looks at education level, at language skills, and at access to education. And when we think about integration as it refers to young people and children, it's very often a focus on education and then the transition to employment. That tends to be the emphasis when we're talking about children and young people. But obviously, children and young people are mostly housed within broader families, so it's important to understand the ways in which their situation within a household, within a family structure, and in a particular place affects their opportunities for integration. So this is where social inclusion matters, levels of income, poverty rates, deprivation, and issues such as health and housing. Active citizenship tends to focus on formal involvement, particularly through acquiring citizenship, through voting and through participation in that formal electoral process. And the 5th category is called welcoming society. So it tends to be people's attitudes towards immigrants, immigrants' experience of discrimination, their sense of belonging, and their sense of trust, some of which are difficult to capture other than through subjective measures, answering questions about whether or not you feel you belong. So these are the 5 ways in which immigrant integration outcomes are being measured. And while they're not perfect, they provide a really good snapshot of the things that we think are important for people to be able to participate in a society. Obviously, different places have different needs, so it's important to use these indicators in a spatially aware way. There are things that will matter more in Ireland than in other places, things that were perhaps less important in Ireland than other places. So if we as a society are serious about immigrant integration, we need to have a sense of what we think an integrated society would look like. And that has to involve not just immigrant outcomes in terms of things that can be measurable for immigrants, but also about how society as a whole makes space for immigrants through this process of welcoming and through making those the opportunities available for people to participate. So, looking at the indicators then, what we wanted to do was think about these immigrant integration indicators, use existing data. So we didn't do any new research in terms of integration, but we wanted to use what already existed, whether that was the census or the labour force survey, which was previously called the Quarterly National Household Survey here, through the European Social Survey and so on. So we took the existing data sets and said, what can this tell us about Ireland, but looking in more detail at these regions and at these particular groups. I'll tell you right now that even though we thought we'd be able to learn about returning Irish immigrants, we can't, because the data is almost it's pretty much useless in terms of identifying returning Irish immigrants. But we were able to learn about EU13 nationals and rest of world nationals, and we were able to learn about the specific issues that arise in the border region and in the Dublin region. Louth at the time was included in the border region. It's since been moved, but I think it gives an important insight into what's happening here. So in terms of groups, the key things that we found in terms of labour force participation is that we have higher levels of employment and unemployment among many migrant groups. And there are differences between the experiences of EU13 and rest of world migrants. So in particular, rest of world migrants are more likely to be experiencing unemployment than migrants who are from the EU13 countries. So there is a difference in terms of immigrant experience, particularly in access to employment. And the other really important thing, and this has been happening in Ireland, we've seen evidence of it for a number of years now, is sectoral concentration. What that means is if you're from a particular immigrant group, then you're more likely to find employment in particular sectors. So people are being channeled into employment in particular sectors because of where they come from. It's not related to their skills or their qualifications in many instances. It's the work that's available to them. And what we're seeing for EU13 immigrants in particular, but for some rest of world immigrants also, is a concentration in the sectors of employment that are more likely to be low paid, that are more likely to be precarious, that are more likely to have difficult working conditions. So this pattern's been happening in Ireland for well over a decade now, and there's no clear evidence that it's changing even with the economic upturn. The second key finding in relation to groups, and I think probably one of the most crucial findings, is the really significant differences in terms of people's experience of housing tenure. So to put it very bluntly, people from Ireland and people from the UK, because migrants from the UK tend to mirror the Irish population, are significantly more likely to be living in their own home, whether it's with a mortgage or with that mortgage paid off. Immigrants are way more likely to be living in private rental accommodation. So there is a really significant gap in terms of people's access to housing in Ireland based on their immigrant or native status. And we know that is incredibly important given the housing crisis in Ireland, given the pressure on private rental accommodation, and also the extent to which people living in private rental accommodation have very little security in terms of their ability to remain in place, to continue accessing services through that address, and to build senses of community in place. So the uncertainty that comes from living in the private rental sector in Ireland is exacerbated for immigrants because of a lack of other forms of access to housing, for example, to mortgage financing. So housing tenure is a really crucial issue in relation to immigrant integration now and into the future in Ireland, and it affects people's ability to integrate in a whole range of ways. There are other issues around social inclusion for groups, which is that there are clear levels of concern around deprivation and poverty, so an overrepresentation of immigrant groups in those who are experiencing deprivation and poverty. And also really low levels of trade union membership among immigrants who are working in Ireland, in part because of the sectors that they're working in. But if integration is about people's ability to participate in their communities and their workplaces, and the OECD has suggested that trade union membership is one really good and important measure of this, there are very clear differences between immigrants and native-born in that respect. If we're to look at regions, so interestingly, Claire made the point that immigrants are more likely to concentrate in cities. We're seeing a slightly different pattern in Ireland, particularly for EU13 immigrants who are not concentrated in cities, but who are living in small towns and rural areas throughout Ireland. So there's a much more dispersed pattern of settlement for EU13 immigrants, but there is a concentration of immigrants from the rest of the world, in Dublin in particular, and in some of the other larger cities. We picked as I said, the border region and the Dublin region precisely because of these differences. But there are important differences in the age profile of immigrants in both of those regions. So there's a much older profile in the border region, in part connected to immigrants coming to the border region from the UK. So that's one of the issues there. But there's also a difference in terms of youth and young people living in the border in the Dublin region. So we need to understand the age profile of immigrants. The tendency is to think about immigrants as young and concentrated in particular areas, and obviously that's important to people here. But that age profile matters in terms of understanding the services and the settlement services that are necessary in different areas. So we need to understand those differences. And we also need to understand the underlying differences between regions in Ireland. So people move to places that have their own social and economic and political characteristics. So they're moving to places that are already placed in hierarchies of economic or social well-being. And people moving to the border region are in an area with, in Ireland, a much higher level of unemployment, with a different employment profile, and with different opportunities, economic and other opportunities for people to participate. So we see higher levels of unemployment for immigrants in the border region. The border region has a higher level, but immigrants, of course, are experiencing unemployment more in that region. We're seeing sectoral concentration in both regions as well, obviously, significantly more people employed in agriculture in the border region with the consequences that stem from that. But another key finding in terms of regional differentiation is that there are lower levels of education reported in the border region for the population as a whole and for immigrants compared to the Dublin region. And there are also lower levels of self-reported English language proficiency in the border region. So the ability to communicate in English matters for people's ability to integrate in Ireland. If there are lower levels of English language proficiency within a household, then that matters if you think, for example, of having children translating for their parents when it comes to healthcare or in dealing with the state. So we need to see those differences for thinking about how they might affect integration now and into the future. That's a very quick overview of those differences, many of which will be familiar to you, but which are evidenced in particular by the 2016 census. But the next thing we wanted to do then was link this to the settlement services that are available for particular migrant groups and in those two regions. So what we attempted to do was say, if we were new in Ireland, if we were living in the border region, if we were living in the Dublin region, or if we were a member of a particular immigrant group, how would we learn about the settlement services that are available? So we looked to see what information was publicly accessible to immigrants through websites, through other public information, and not just through the word of mouth that dominates quite a lot of how people learn things in an Irish context. So if you're coming, you didn't know anybody, and you were trying to figure out how to get help, that's what we were looking for. We were treating it in this way. So what we attempted to do then was map the settlement services that were available in these 4 areas that the Zaragoza indicators of integration suggested were important. So what kinds of settlement services were available in relation to employment, to education, to social inclusion, or in relation to active citizenship? So this is our attempt to map these settlement services for immigrants in general. And what we see here, and this is something that you will be very familiar with, is that in Ireland, we very much rely on non-governmental organisations to provide many of these services. So the types of services that are provided by government departments that are specifically targeting immigrants are pretty limited. In many instances, what we see is that services are effectively subcontracted to NGOs nationally and locally. And we do see groups like local development companies or family resource centres involved, but often they're doing it on a shoestring, or they're doing it targeting particular groups based on status rather than on need. This was our attempt to map the settlement services for the regions. Here are the non-governmental organisations or the quasi-governmental organisations involved, again, in providing services that are related to these four areas. We see how LDCs, local development companies, are particularly important in this instance. And we're also, again, seeing a range of non-governmental organisations providing this. Irish government departments claim to be involved in mainstreaming integration services, but our evidence of mainstreaming is pretty scant. And what we see is that local authorities are also vary in the extent to which they provide integration-related services, and that's often finance-related. So in contrast to the European survey of the key factors, in Ireland finance does matter, and in particular the issue of immigrant integration was utterly sidelined from 2008 when austerity hit, based, I think, on an assumption that immigrants in Ireland were temporary and that with the recession immigrants would leave. The reality is very different, but it has led us to a position of a lost decade when it comes to thinking about integration and how integration might work in the Irish context. So these are the key issues that we found in relation to settlement services. That settlement services, and again, these are services that are designed to help people in the process of integration. That settlement services are socially and spatially uneven. That some groups are targeted more than others in settlement services that are status dependent, but that they are spatially uneven, and that we particularly see this in rural areas where in many instances the provision of services is reliant on one or two people, often funded on a short-term basis, not in any kind of sustained way. And it's the energy of those individuals that makes something happen when those individuals are no longer working in that area, that energy dissipates. So it's socially and spatially uneven. That the provision of settlement services is absolutely reliant on organisations that are not funded in a sustainable or in a long-term way to provide those services. So there's a reliance on local development companies, on non-governmental organisations, in some instances on local authorities and others, but that very often these organisations are put into competition with each other to get access to a very limited amount of funding that's available for integration-related services. And that funding often goes to a new project that seems exciting rather than necessarily to a project that has been working in a sustained and in a proven way. So we have the ideology of competition for scarce resources, and we have a lack of commitment to long-term and sustained funding for integration services locally and through local authorities. The other issue, of course, is access. And what we found through our attempt to map settlement services is that access to services is very often on the basis of immigrant status rather than on need. So subgroups are defined, particular groups. So for example, women not at work, or refugees or asylum seekers may or may not be included. But the services that are being provided are services that actually are relevant to a number of immigrants. And so we think that a needs-based approach rather than a status-based approach would be more helpful. But we also found lots of evidence of people appearing to abide by the rules and in the process making space for others to participate. So they said that their service was targeting a particular group. They made sure that when they provided the service that it had representatives from that group, but people bent the rules to try and make access for others, which is something we haven't charted because we didn't want to draw attention to it, but I'm saying it to you here as people who I'm sure are involved in similar imaginative approaches to providing services to immigrants. The third issue is integration policy. So it wasn't the focus of this research project, but it was the focus of another research project that I carried out with Cleona Murphy, who's based in the law department in Maynooth. We did an audit of integration policy in the public sector. We wrote to close to 500 bodies that we identified as public sector bodies and asked them for their integration or diversity or inclusion policy or strategy. And then we assessed the policies, strategies, or statements that we received back. In doing that, we wanted to see if there was a way of developing an integration policy that could be informed by a human rights approach, particularly given the public sector duty in relation to human rights. We interviewed a small number of organisations that we thought had made good progress in the development of of an integration policy. And this report, which is available on the Maynooth website, as is the report on integration and settlement services, provides some guidelines for how a public sector organisation could develop an integration policy informed by a human rights perspective. But in general, we found local authorities a little more proactive in terms of the development of integration strategies, and we found government departments much more reluctant to respond positively to our request. So there are large gaps in terms of integration policy in the public sector, and particularly in departments that are nominally responsible for the mainstreaming of integration policy. So there are lots of gaps appearing in this way. So drawing on these different projects and thinking about what this might mean now, when there seems to be a political willingness to address the issue of integration for the first time in over a decade. The first is in relation to outcomes. We need to keep monitoring integration outcomes. One of the difficulties in doing this is gathering data. So for example, if we're thinking about asylum seekers and refugees, in those large-scale attempts to gather data like the census, there's no way of identifying somebody who is in Ireland as a refugee and who has come through the asylum process. So our large-scale data collection is not going to gather much of this information. It will tell us about broad categories of immigrants. It will tell us about people on the basis of place of birth. But if we want to look at integration outcomes for particular groups of people, then perhaps we need to find other ways of gathering that data and to put pressure on the CSO and others to do that. That's also going to be particularly important in the longer term because, again, the census isn't gathering appropriate data to map the integration outcomes of people of migrant origin. So it's not gathering the data that we need in order to tell us what's happening to children, whether they're first or 1.5 or second generation children. This is an issue that other countries with a longer experience of immigration are addressing, and I think it's one we need to pay attention to because the potential for social exclusion for children of an immigrant background as they become adults is high. We know that from other countries and we have an opportunity to address it. So we do need to supplement existing data, large-scale data sets with other specific research that we need in order to measure outcomes that are necessary in an Irish context. If we're to talk about processes, so the settlement services, if we know what integration looks like, then we should be providing services to help people get to that point. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, but we're not doing it. We're particularly not doing it in relation to housing, because the level of settlement services available to immigrants in accessing housing across Ireland is almost non-existent. There's a sense that people live or die on their own initiative, and then we allow them to do so without providing that support. So housing, and particularly the housing needs of immigrants in the private rental sector, absolutely have to be addressed if this is to lead to fairer outcomes. We have to expand the range of settlement services and access to settlement services across Ireland. And we need to understand that people have different needs at different stages of their lives in Ireland. So what somebody needs as a new immigrant is very different to what they need after 5 years or 10 years. We should pay attention to that. And we have to commit to appropriate funding for integration and integration-related services in a country where 17% of the population was born outside the country. So we're still in that top layer of immigrant population in Europe, even with the results of the last census. And in terms of integration policies, well, we need integration policies. We don't have them across most of our public sector. We have an immigrant integration strategy now, which has just been published. We need to translate that into policy at national level and at subnational level in ways that are appropriate for the Irish context. This is what the migrant integration strategy says. It says that we have to have a long-term vision of Ireland as a society where migrants and those of migrant origin play an active role in communities, workplaces, and politics. We can't just focus on the exceptional migrants who succeed in spite of the structural obstacles. We have to look at our migrant population and the relationship between immigrants and the native population more clearly. We have to look at it more critically, and we have to think about what we as a society can do in order to bring about this type of integration between immigrants and native born now and into the future. Thanks for your time.